The smoke hung in the trees like a second fog, blue-grey and choking. Men in dark tartan surged forward through shattered limbs and splintered trunks, boots slipping on mud, bayonets gleaming with a dull, cold light. The drone of pipes cut through the crack of muskets and the distant thunder of artillery. A sound that made old soldiers say afterwards they could hear fear itself. At the front, the Black Watch climbed over the barricade of cut timber that the French had thrown up before their works. An abattis so dense that men went in hand over hand, chopping at branches with broadswords and bayonets to make a path. They kept running. They did not wait for neat volleys or the slow business of artillery. They pressed into the teeth of an enemy prepared for them and, for a long, terrible minute, simply would not give ground. This was July 8, 1758, at Fort Carillon, known to English readers as Ticonderoga, and the scene seared a contradiction into military memory. It was at once a catastrophe and a forging, a tactical failure that hardened into fear. How does a unit that suffers grievous losses become the thing enemies dread? Why did sight of a dark tartan, the scream of a bagpipe, or the approach of a compact Highland line cause commanders across Europe and Empire to pause, re-evaluate, sometimes recoil? The answer is not a single battle or a single trait. It is a compound. Clan cohesion made martial, a style of fighting that exploited shock and intimacy, a disciplined adoption of regular drill and weapons, and a set of visual and auditory signals, kilt, pipes, red hackle, badge, that worked like psychological weapons long before their muskets spoke. If this kind of deep dive into units and battlefield psychology is your kind of history, like and subscribe. There's more coming. To understand the fear, we must start where fear itself was planned, not on a battlefield, but in a Highland glen. In the years after the Jacobite uprisings, the British state faced a difficult problem. The Highlands, with their clan loyalties and rugged terrain, resisted centralized control. That resistance had erupted into armed treason and threatened the fragile peace of the kingdom. In response, authorities did not simply attempt to crush the Highlands, at least at first, so much as to co-opt them. Beginning in the 1720s, under the supervision of General George Wade and others charged with pacifying the region, the Crown sanctioned the formation of independent Highland companies, small, locally raised formations drawn from loyalist clans. Their job was practical and paradoxical. They were to police their own countrymen, to keep watch over roads and passes, to arrest cattle thieves, to suppress low-level disorder. That practical guarding duty, the watch over the Highlands, gave the men their common name long before they became imperial shock troops. Those companies were not anonymous levies. They were made up of Gaelic-speaking men tied by kinship and local obligation, Campbells who knew the glens around Loch Awe, Grants and Frasers from the northeastern forests, Munros from the firmer lands beyond. Service was woven into a social fabric of patronage and honor. A man in a company might find himself standing alongside cousins and neighbors, bound by the same obligations of hospitality and vengeance that governed life in the glen. That kinship produced an intense cohesion on the march and on the battlefield. When orders were obeyed, they were obeyed by men who trusted their neighbor to hold the line. To borrow a modern phrase, cohesion was their force multiplier. Practicalities shaped their look and their name. The black in Black Watch likely referred to the dark, subdued plaids many of these companies wore, cloth that blended with moor and night, and to the covert, watchful work they undertook. The kilt and tartan were not romantic costume in a parade sense. They were working clothing adapted to terrain and to the requirements of heavy movement. Weapons, too, reflected a hybrid identity. Men carried muskets and bayonets like regular soldiers, but many still kept the traditional broadsword and dirk, and some retained the small round shield called a targe. That mix, firearm and ferris blade, allowed a unit to fight at range with disciplined volleys and to become instantly terrifying at close quarters. Each soldier was trained for both. The Crown moved slowly from using the independent companies as a policing tool to absorbing them into the standing army. By the late 1730s, the companies were being regularized into numbered regiments on the British establishment, later known collectively as the 42nd Regiment of Foot. What changed was not the heart of the men, but the organization around it. The army's drill and discipline were grafted onto clan loyalty. Musketry, parade ground exercises, and the hierarchies of rank began to shape what had been a looser, locally maintained fighting force. The result was a unit that could move like a clan warband and hold like a textbook line regiment. That dual nature would become central to their fearsome reputation. They could charge like Highlanders and stand like line infantry. Their first appearances on the European stage made men uncomfortable in a new way. At battles such as Fontenoy in 1745, in the thick of the War of the Austrian Succession and its broader web of continental conflicts, the Highland fighters presented a style that contrasted sharply with the linear, volley-by-volley warfare of the 18th century continental armies. An army trained for disciplined, measured fire could find itself unnerved by a mass of men closing at speed, abandoning the long-range duel for the intimacy of the broadsword, the dirk, the thrust of a bayonet in a space where orderly musketry mattered less. Contemporary observers noted the shock value, a wide, thundering charge that arrived before the enemy could complete their controlled volleys, a compact formation that used terrain and momentum to reach the foe. Whether or not their charges always broke prepared troops, the spectacle had an outsized psychological effect. Armies are fragile organisms. The sudden sight of men in unfamiliar dress running to close quarters with weapons designed for mutilation rather than formal wound introduced an element of terror into an opponent's calculus. It was not merely that Highlanders could fight, it was that they fought in a manner that made other soldiers feel that the rules had changed. There is a technical anatomy to the Highland charge worth unpacking, because it explains both success and failure. The charge was not simply headlong bravery. A well-executed Highland advance could begin with a controlled musket volley, sometimes a single, rapid discharge intended to disrupt an enemy's formation, and then drop the muzzles or sheathe the bayonets as the line accelerated. The pace was short, intense. The aim was to cover the ground from firing distance to grappling range before the enemy could reload and stabilize. At close quarters, the broadsword and dirk mattered because they were designed for cutting and thrusting in confined spaces where a musket was less effective. Where European cavalry or disciplined infantry expected a slow, ordered approach, a sudden screaming rush of men in the kilt could smash morale even if it did not always break the enemy's formation entirely. But the same method carried obvious risks. Mass charges against prepared defenses, fieldworks, or concentrated artillery were dangerous to the point of folly. The Highland emphasis on shock and close combat was most effective against troops who were unsteady, untested, or unprepared to trade musket shot for hand-to-hand chaos. When the ground favored the defender, when abatis or palisades or a well-sighted battery met the charge, the results could be catastrophic. The lesson the Black Watch would learn at Ticonderoga was born of that contradiction. The British campaign in North America during the 7 Years' War brought the regiment to a theatre of dense forest, narrow approaches, and field fortifications that blurred the clean geometry of European battlefields. At Fort Carillon, the French had made every advantage of the terrain. They felled trees into a crawling barrier of staggered trunks and sharpened branches, an abatis meant to unnerve and to channel an attacker into predicted killing zones. British commanders debated siege and bombardment, but for reasons that history still passes, a mix of impatience, overconfidence, and the peculiar stubbornness of offensive doctrine, a frontal assault was ordered. The result was brutal and public. Accounts from that day, recorded by officers and in the letters of chaplains who afterward described the scene to relatives, paint a ghastly picture without indulging in lurid detail. Men fell tangled among the branches, the ground slick with blood and sweat turned to a kind of conveyor belt that the living had to climb over the dead to advance. Some eyewitnesses later emphasized the stoicism, the men who continued to run even as comrades lay prone beside them. And that image was picked up and amplified in newspapers and pamphlets back in Britain. At home, the tale read like proof of Highland mettle. Even when everything failed tactically, the Black Watch did not break. To French eyes and to the soldiers in the field, the scene was different. A grim example of the cost of charging prepared defenses. The same act produced both an enhancement of fear and a clear lesson on the limits of the method. There is an important caveat in these stories. Contemporary reports vary on command intent. Some sources suggest the Black Watch's advance at Ticonderoga was a response to local conditions on the ground, a spontaneous, ferocious push by men who saw a chance or felt compelled by the momentum of their comrades. Others describe orders that pushed the regiment forward as part of a larger, more disciplined attack plan. Historians still debate the precise balance of initiative versus command in that moment. What is not in doubt is the practical fact. The abattis and the lack of heavy preparatory fire made the assault extraordinarily costly. Exact casualty lists for the day are contested and at times inconsistent across records. It is safer to describe losses as severe and decisive in their impact on the unit and on public perception, rather than to assert precise numbers. Perception mattered as much as material loss. The image of men in dark tartan scaling the dead and going on, the bagpipes keening and the pipe's drone carrying across broken timber, entered the British press and the imagination of commanders. Even in defeat, or perhaps because of it, the Black Watch acquired the aura of an almost elemental force, an enemy that would keep coming. That aura over time would magnify and spread. The newspapers in London printed accounts that, for readers far from the frontier, read less like military minutiae and more like proof of a national character. A people who, however wild, could stand against a modern army and not yield. That public narrative fed back into the regiment itself, raising its profile, bolstering recruitment from the Highlands, and making the sight of a kilted line functionally different in the minds of opponents than a line of trousers. But the Black Watch's fearsome reputation was not simply a product of optics and press. Two other ingredients lay at the heart of the phenomenon: disciplined adaptation and a capacity to be instrumentally integrated into larger army operations. Already in the mid-18th century, the regiment was learning to combine its shock tactics with the drills of a standing army. Officers trained recruits in steady firing, taught them to form into line and to reform into more defensive postures when needed. A man who could sprint forward with broadsword in hand could, with the right command and practice, form square against cavalry or hold a line under steady musketry. That flexibility, the ability to be both savage in charge and steady in formation, made the unit more dangerous than a mere irregular band. The military culture within the regiment also played a role. There was a distinct ethic that mixed personal honor, religious seriousness, and rigorous training. Many Highland soldiers were known for devout Presbyterian piety. In camp they sang psalms, in march they observed modesty of dress in simple ways, and in battle they maintained order under pressure. Religion, in this sense, was less a battlefield tactic than a social glue that reinforced obedience and mutual care. A cohort who prayed together and marched together was more likely to hold together when shot began to fall. Finally, the visual and auditory components of the Black Watch's presence cannot be separated from the purely tactical. The kilt, for soldiers of other armies, looked anomalous and unsettling. The bagpipes, played into the wind on the eve of battle or in the charge itself, issued a tone that, while unfamiliar, could cut through command noise and establish a rhythm for an advancing line. The adoption later of the red hackle and the Sphinx badge, honors earned in campaigns abroad, turned the regiment into a collection of instantly readable signs. An enemy who glimpsed the red plume or the Sphinx device learned that these were not generic troops, but an experienced unit with battlefield honors. Psychological warfare does not require academic planning. It works as rumor, reputation, sound, and sight combined. The sequence of events after Ticonderoga shows how a reputation can feed itself. Losses that ruin a regiment in raw manpower can nevertheless create stories, heroic or tragic, that enhance its symbolic value. Officers sent letters, newspapers printed stirring narratives, families recounted stoic ends, and theatre and print culture back in Britain turned those images into national myth. Recruiters exploited that myth. Men in the Highlands, hearing of their fellows' steadfastness on the frontier, stepped forward to serve. The British state, which had once been suspicious of Highlanders, recognized an instrument. Loyalty, when organized, could be an asset to imperial power. Yet the story should not be told without its uncomfortable lines. The formation of the Black Watch was part of a political pacification that had winners and losers at home. Its later roles in colonies and imperial wars would inevitably tie them to policies that brought dispossession and suffering to others. To admire a regiment's discipline and valor is not to whitewash the larger context of empire. The fear they inspired on the battlefield was real, but the causes they fought under and the political ends they enabled must remain part of the account. Even as they moved from policing the Highlands to campaigning across the globe, the Black Watch retained a core identity, an ability to harness social cohesion, to adapt tactics as battlefields demanded, and to stand as a symbol that amplified fear. That combination, culture disciplined, image weaponized, and tactics flexible, sets up the rest of their story. After Ticonderoga, the regiment would return to Europe and meet Napoleonic France on more than one field. It would take honors in distant sands and face the unromantic guns of modern warfare. Each campaign would add layers to the reputation, sometimes validation, sometimes refutation, but always attention. Across decades, opponents learned different lessons from the same unit. In one case, enemies saw them as a shock force to be routed before they closed. In another, they learned to respect their steadiness under fire and feared what that steadiness enabled when combined with a sudden charge. And so the Black Watch acquired the two faces of military fame. The visceral terror inspired in the moment of contact, and the quieter, more strategic dread that comes when a commander realizes he faces a formation that is trained, battle-tested, and willing to close the fight on terms that favor close combat. The memory of Ticonderoga lingered, circulating in dispatches and letters, in the printed page and in the barrack room tales told to new recruits. It became, paradoxically, a recruiting poster and a cautionary tale. Men would later point to that day as proof of a tradition that had been tempered in fire. That tradition would be called upon in later wars, in Europe and beyond. But reputation alone does not win fields. It affects choices. Opposing commanders who feared the Black Watch might deploy artillery differently, alter their formations, or refrain from certain maneuvers. And these adjustments, in turn, shaped how and where the 42nd was employed thereafter. By the time the regiment was absorbed into the broader structure of the British Army, the state had learned to exploit a paradox. The Highland soldiers' private loyalties could be transformed into public discipline, and the spectacle of Highland bodies at bayonet and sword could serve national ends. The Crown and the colonelcy found useful theatre in the dark tartan and the drone of pipes, symbols that recruited, that rallied, and that unnerved. But the regiment's commanders, and the men themselves, were not immune to the necessary evolution of arms and doctrine. Firearms improved, field fortifications became more lethal, and the strategic realities of empire demanded more than massed charges. The tension between tradition and modernity would become a recurring theme. When to charge, when to form line, when to skirmish, when to entrench. That tension came to a dramatic head not long after Ticonderoga in the trial by fire of continental Europe. At Fontenoy and similar fields, the sight of Highlanders crossing open ground in a frenzy of motion upset the neat maths of the line infantry. Commanders with experience against them learned to respect speed and to guard against a single, decisive shock. Meanwhile, the Black Watch itself began to institutionalize lessons. Training in volley fire, in forming squares against cavalry, in coordinated maneuvers with artillery, all were folded into the unit's practice. The regiment did not remain static. Its fearsome reputation depended on its willingness to learn from defeats as much as to celebrate victories. The men who ran into the abatis at Ticonderoga were the same soldiers who, decades later, in different uniforms and a different battlefield grammar, would hold a square at the shock of mounted troops. Not every enemy took the same view. Some colonial opponents, unfamiliar with European drills, saw only terror and spectacle and reacted accordingly. Others learned quickly, adapting to pipes and plaids with trenches, smokeless rifles and camouflage. The Black Watch's story, then, is also the story of adaptation being forced upon them as much as chosen. Sometimes they set the terms of battle. Other times the battlefield set the terms for them. The next chapters would take the regiment from the woods of North America back to the sands and plains of a world the British Empire was fast making its own stage. Honors and badges would arrive that codified reputation into uniform detail. Campaigns in Egypt would add symbolic emblems that future enemies would recognize as signs of a hardened, battle-tested regiment. But every honor had been bought with risk, and every reputation could be undone by one misread field. The Black Watch's fearsome standing rested on an uneasy truce between daring and discipline, between ancestral custom and professional soldiering, and that uneasy balance would be tested again and again. They would carry that reputation with them to the sand and the surf of another continent, where imperial ambition met the brittle remnants of a Napoleonic world. In 1801, a British expedition crossed the Mediterranean and landed on the Egyptian coast under the command of Sir Ralph Abercrombie. The campaign was meant to eject a French force that had been garrisoned in Egypt since Bonaparte's campaign years earlier. For the Highland regiments, Egypt presented a different geography and a different enemy, but a familiar test: to bring disciplined violence to bear in a landscape that favored sudden contact and close fighting. The landings and subsequent battles around Abukir and Alexandria were fought as much in cramped, chaotic melee as on open lines. The French, seasoned veterans of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, defended gardens, low ridges, and ruined villages with determined musketry and bayonet work. In that crucible, the 42nd's blend of disciplined volley fire and willingness to close the gap again proved valuable. Contemporary reports emphasize the resolve with which Highland companies pushed into French squares and redoubts, shoulder to shoulder, and locked by shared habit and training. The regiment acquitted itself, and the Egyptian campaign left a catalogue of honors. One of those honors entered the regiment's outward identity. The device of the Sphinx, granted in recognition of service in Egypt, would become an emblem worn on caps and colors, an explicit, portable memory that told any onlooker these men had fought in deserts and come back. The red hackle, the small feather plume that would one day sit upon the bonnet, is often linked in regimental lore to that same campaign. Stories vary, some legend, some contemporary comment, on exactly how that plume was first adopted. Some versions give the origin an almost mythic cast. Others are more prosaic, tying the red feather to regulation and regimental distinction awarded after the campaign. What matters for the regiment's fear factor was not a single item of dress, but the way those tokens worked. A Sphinx badge and a red plume declared experience, hardened service, and a lineage of combat that opponents could read at a glance. If Egypt offered a confirmation of battlefield metal, the Napoleonic Wars would broaden the Black Watch's tactical repertoire and, with it, deepen the respect, if not the dread, felt by foes. By the time Europe convulsed in 1815, the regiment had moved far from the simple binary of wild charge versus line infantry. At Quatre Bras, and then at Waterloo, the Highland regiments appeared on fields where the scale of battle, the presence of cavalry, and the weight of artillery required more than shock. They demanded steadiness, fire control, and improvisation under pressure. At Quatre Bras, June 16, 1815, the British and their allies faced elements of Napoleon's marshals in a fight that would prove crucial to the Waterloo campaign. The 42nd, serving within the British forces that engaged at Quatre Bras, stood in situations where cavalry and infantry collided, where a moment's hesitation could mean collapse. Contemporary accounts of British regiments in that action highlight one recurring feature. When faced with a mounted charge, disciplined infantry could escape disaster by turning inward, forming square, and delivering controlled musketry until the horses balked or the cavalry withdrew. The Black Watch, by then schooled in both the shock of the charge and the steadiness of formation, showed it could do both. The same men who were capable of a screaming approach could, when ordered, close ranks and hold an uncompromising front. That capacity to switch modes mattered in a strategic sense too. Commanders who faced the 42nd had to assume not merely the possibility of a Highland charge, but also the likelihood that, once checked, these same troops could stabilize and hold a line that might then be used to anchor a wider flank. Fear in this context became functional. Opposing generals had to allocate resources and adapt formations in order to neutralize both the immediate threat of close combat and the longer threat of a resilient, experienced infantry line. The psychological edge the Black Watch carried was thus doubled. Its presence could unsettle an enemy's immediate nerves, and its demonstrated steadiness could force a commander to change plans lest the regiment's endurance be translated into operational advantage. That same pattern, spectacle combined with institutional competence, followed the regiment into the expanding reaches of British imperial warfare. The Victorian era, with its far-flung campaigns in Crimea, West Africa, Egypt again and elsewhere, required soldiers who could operate in diverse conditions, slogging through mud in a siege, marching across dusty plains, or hunting irregular forces in jungle and bush. The Black Watch's history in the mid and late 19th century demonstrates a trend toward professionalization without the erasure of identity. Uniforms adapted. The kilt, for instance, though retained ceremonially, was not always practical in certain theaters, and would be supplemented or replaced by more suitable garments for campaign work. Drill and marksmanship took precedence. Skirmishing and scouting, night marches and small unit independence, skills once the preserve of irregulars, were learned and institutionalized. Crimea is instructive. The conflict of 1854-1856 forced many British regiments into trench warfare, prolonged bombardment, and frontal assaults against well-placed batteries. The Black Watch saw action amid the mud and blood of sieges and assaults, and their response showed not only courage, but an evolution of doctrine. Under fire, they executed ordered advances and guarded flanks. In moments of crisis, they relied on the cohesion born of kinship and habit. To a Russian or French observer, a line that held when others might wobble was cause for concern. To a local foe, the sight of a Highland regiment pressing with bayonets and pipes was a compact demonstration of both will and capability. Across imperial campaigns, whether in Ashanti in West Africa, where mixed terrain and tropical disease posed their own threats, or at Tel el-Kebir in Egypt in 1882, where rapid, decisive action against Mahdist and Khedival forces underpinned British aims, the regiment continued to adapt. At Tel el-Kebir, British forces under General Garnet Wolseley executed a night march and dawn assault that relied on surprise, disciplined movement, and rapid firepower. Highland units that took part in such operations learned the costs and benefits of modernized tactics. Surprise could restore the effectiveness of close assault, but the increasing lethality of modern rifles and the sophistication of fieldworks meant that massed frontal charges were no longer the universal solution. Public attention and regimental image also changed in this century. The reach of newspapers, illustrated magazines, and public memorials turned battlefield deeds into narratives for consumption at home. Portraits of kilted soldiers on foreign soil, stories of pipe tunes played before advance, and the display of captured colors fed into a cultural myth-making. This process amplified the Black Watch's psychological impact. An enemy seeing signs of the regiment might not only fear its military competence, but also the momentum of an empire behind it. Again, that dynamic worked as much on the imaginations of potential recruits and readers as it did on opposing commanders. Reputation became a force multiplier, feeding recruitment and institutional pride. Yet every era's triumphs also contained warnings. The Boer War at the turn of the 20th century, and in particular the Battle of Magersfontein, often spelled Magersfontein, sometimes seen in older texts as Magersfontein, in December 1899, exposed the limits of a reputation built on close assault and spectacle when faced with entrenched firepower and modern rifle technology. South African marksmen, armed with the smokeless Mauser cartridge and sheltered in the reverse slopes and trenches of prepared positions, produced a level of lethality that traditional tactics could not meet. British columns approaching in daylight and in predictable formations were cut down at ranges and in a manner that Victorian drill had not fully anticipated. At Magersfontein, Highland troops, including battalions associated with the Black Watch lineage, formed part of assaults that struck into elaborate Boer positions. The Boers' use of trenches and concealment denied attackers the psychological momentum of a sudden charge. There was no exposed frontal mass to shock, only invisible fire from prepared positions. The result was a disaster for attacking units. Men who had been celebrated for their ability to close and to break now discovered how deadly concealment and modern rifles could be. The lesson was stark and unforgiving. Courage and tradition could not substitute for reconnaissance, adaptation in formation, and a doctrinal understanding of new weapons and entrenchment. The tactical model that had inspired fear in earlier centuries now required radical revision. That failure, however, did not erase the Black Watch's central strengths. It refined them. The regiment emerged from the Boer War chastened, but not broken. Officers and men who survived those fields carried new practices back into the army. Improved use of cover, changes in approach to assault, and better integration of artillery and reconnaissance. In short, the institutional learning that had long helped the Black Watch combine clan cohesion with army discipline now had to apply itself to a mechanized, smokeless battlefield. That capacity to learn, and to survive the very tests that could have destroyed their legend, helped maintain the aura of fear in a different way. Opponents who had once feared the kilted charge now hesitated at the sight of veterans marked by hard lessons and modern competence. Through the 20th century, the regiment continued to evolve. The First World War demanded something the old Highland charge could not offer: sustained, industrialized firepower, extended trench lines, and cooperation with new arms such as machine guns and artillery barrages. The Black Watch furnished battalions that fought in the Western Front's mud and blood, where personal valor was real, but the strategic calculus was dominated by logistics, fire control, and massed support. In these contests, the regiment's cohesion, its deeply rooted mutual loyalty and disciplined training, continued to matter. Comradeship in the face of protracted attrition conserved combat effectiveness in ways that single acts of bravery could not. The image of Highlanders pressing forward under machine gun fire added to the legend, not because tactics had remained the same, but because the social glue that bound the men permitted endurance under conditions that would have broken less cohesive units. In the Second World War and beyond, the Black Watch adapted to motor transport, combined arms operations, and an expanded professionalization. The kilt, once a practical garment, increasingly became ceremonial. The colors and insignia carried meaning mostly in parades and remembrance. While in the field, soldiers wore uniforms and boots designed for modern operations. Yet the psychological component of history, pipes, tartan, badge, remained valuable in other registers, recruiting, morale, and the projection of regimental continuity. The persistence of certain traditions helped maintain esprit de corps across generations, a continuity that hardened the idea of the Black Watch as a unit to be reckoned with, whatever the precise configuration of arms and tactics. Understanding why adversaries feared the Black Watch requires bringing these threads into a single weave. First, there was social cohesion. Many soldiers came from overlapping kinship networks and small communities where reputation and honor were immediate, lived things. This produced a depth of trust in the ranks that could not be easily replicated by conscripts pulled from disparate locales. Trust meant steadiness. Second, there was tactical distinctiveness. The regiment's historical mastery of shock action, short, violent advances intended to bring the fight to close quarters, combined with a disciplined adoption of conventional drills. That mix of audacity and steadiness made the Black Watch an unusual and uncomfortable thing for opponents. Third, symbolic projection amplified the practical. The visual signatures, dark tartan, the red hackle, cap badges bearing trophies of foreign campaigns, functioned as rapid communication. These were not green recruits, these were tested soldiers. The pipes, too, while hardly a battlefield technology, carried emotional weight. Music in war can fortify one's own resolve and unsettle the enemy. A rhythm and a sound pattern that united a formation could heighten the sense that these men were moving as a single, implacable organism. Fourth, institutional reputation matters. The press, the army lists, and regimental prints carried accounts of constancy and sacrifice that escalated an opponent's perception of threat. Fear, after all, is often anticipatory. A commander who had read stories of a regiment's past might overestimate its present capacities or shift resources in ways that opened other tactical opportunities. But myth and reality existed in tension. Magersfontein shows how myth can mislead. Valor does not neutralize new technology. The psychological terror of a kilted line becomes irrelevant if the enemy is nowhere to be seen because he sits hidden on reverse slope, concealed from approach. Likewise, the glamour of tribal cohesion could be undercut by disease, poor supply, or strategic misdirection. Regimental discipline depended on competent leadership and sound logistics as much as on cultural glue. There is a final, human dimension to reconcile. The way in which fear, inflicted and felt, entangles with cost. The Black Watch's history is studded with gallantry and endurance, but also with death and injury, with families bereaved and villages diminished. To credit the regiment with inspiring dread is not to celebrate battlefield suffering. It is to understand the mechanisms by which a military reputation is formed and propagated. Every psychological edge in warfare is bought by human lives. Narratives in newspapers, in the service records and memoirs, and in the trophies that hung in barrack rooms, all masked that cost with words of honor and banners. The reality was more complex. The same regimental cohesion that made the Black Watch formidable also made it a repository for trauma carried across generations. That complexity is precisely why the unit's reputation outlasted individual battles. Where some regiments were remembered for one great day, the Black Watch accumulated episodes across multiple eras. The forested massacre that birthed its legend in North America, the grind and honor of imperial deserts, the disciplined stands on European plains, the humbling lessons of modern warfare. Each episode modified the public and military imagination and fed into the next. Opponents adjusted. Sometimes tactics followed legend, sometimes legend followed tactics. The interplay made the regiment's presence on a battlefield more than the sum of its rifles. There is an institutional lesson here too. Armies that can absorb defeat and integrate its lessons survive. Those that cannot are consigned to obsolescence. The Black Watch's fearsome reputation persisted because the regiment repeatedly absorbed shocks, both tactical and existential, and evolved. When a method failed, new doctrine was sometimes grafted onto old habits. Formations learned to skirmish, to use cover, to coordinate with artillery and reconnaissance. The social cohesion that made the regiment effective in a previous century became a vehicle for institutional learning in the next. In practical terms, that meant officers and men who trusted one another could execute new orders effectively and maintain cohesion during doctrinal transitions. The final reason for their being feared, then, is cumulative. The Black Watch presented a continuity of utility that opponents could not easily discount. Across centuries, from Scots policing glens to soldiers fighting in European battles and imperial fronts, the regiment offered a pattern of cohesion, of aggressive close combat when conditions permitted, and of steady formation when required. It presented visual and auditory signals that communicated this pattern before contact. That anticipatory knowledge altered enemy behavior long before the first shot. To stand against that kind of unit required preparation, adaptation, and sometimes an acceptance of higher immediate risk. For many opponents, the calculus tilted toward caution. That very caution, repeated and recorded, fed the narrative of fear. And yet the fear is not an unambiguous badge of moral virtue. The Black Watch served under imperial directives that sometimes dispossessed and punished colonized peoples. Their fearsome reputation played a role in the projection of state power. A sober account cannot elide that reality. Respect for soldierly qualities must be balanced against an understanding of the political ends served. The regiment's military excellence existed within a broader imperial architecture whose outcomes were not always just. Historians and descendants alike must hold both truths at once: bravery and complicity, endurance and consequence. What, then, is the concise answer to the title's question? Why did the Black Watch become the most feared soldiers in British history? Because fear was not produced by spectacle alone, but by the systematic fusion of 5 interlocking factors. An unusually deep social cohesion that functioned as a combat multiplier, a tactical identity that blended ferocious close combat capabilities with disciplined drill, a willingness and capacity to learn and adapt institutional practice across changing technological eras, a set of powerful, easily legible symbols, tartan, pipes, hackle, badges, that communicated experience and resolve at a glance, and the amplification of battlefield deeds into public narrative, which turned episodic courage into a persistent, strategic reputation. Where one factor might have been ephemeral, their combination proved durable. That answer also carries a warning. The Black Watch's legend was partly built on heroic catastrophe, instances where courage could not substitute for reconnaissance, artillery preparation, or tactical prudence. Magersfontein and similar defeats remind us that fearsome reputation is fragile. It requires constant renewal through adaptation and competently led service. The most dangerous thing for any unit is to confuse legend with doctrine, to let myth substitute for learning. The Black Watch survived because, more often than not, it refused that substitution, updating tactics and training to meet the new realities of firepower, entrenchment, and mechanized logistics. Today, the image of the Black Watch persists in both museums and memory. Ceremonial kilts and tartans are displayed in regimental halls. Sphinx badges and red hackles are preserved in glass cases. Pipe music plays on memorial days and in films. At the same time, the modern descendants of those old companies fight in contexts far removed from the early glens. multinational operations, peacekeeping missions, and security tasks that demand cultural intelligence as much as bayonet work. The ceremonial remains because identity endures. The practical duty continues because military utility adapts. Enemies of the 18th and 19th centuries feared the sight and sound of a regiment that combined savage momentum with professional steadiness. Modern observers looking back can see that fear is a product of specific material conditions and social structures. To be feared was as much about making opponents miscalculate as it was about actual battlefield outcomes. The Black Watch became, in effect, a strategic variable, a unit whose presence changed the game before the first exchange of fire. If one last image might capture that paradox, it is this: a line of men, boots sinking into foreign earth, faces windburned and set. A plume of red nodded on a bonnet, the faint, uncanny keening of bagpipes threading the air. They advanced neither as unthinking savages nor as mere automatons of empire, but as a body forged by place and law, by family and regulation, by music and drill, and by the long, uneven lessons of many wars. To face them was to face an accumulated force of identity and institution, a combination that inspired dread in the moment and a reputation that would echo into posterity. If this deep dive into regimental history and battlefield psychology intrigued you, subscribe and share your thoughts below. Tell us which moment in the Black Watch's story surprised you most, and we'll explore more units that shaped military history.